What would you do if a lost child called you dad? On a rainy night, beneath the cold, forgotten bridge at Hollow Ridge Crossing, a little girl stood soaked to the bone, and a silent man pulled up in a battered truck. He didn't ask her name. He didn't call for help, but that one quiet choice changed the fate of three lives forever. Do you believe love can be chosen, even without blood ties? If that question touches something inside you, hit subscribe. Leave a comment below because today's story is one you won't forget. On a night soaked in relentless rain, deep within the sparse woods of Black Birch Grove, the kind of place no one dares to stop after dark, Sebastian Cole, a silver-haired man living alone in a rusted-out truck, was crouched over a tiny camp stove, trying to warm up a bowl of soup, when a faint sound drifted through the downpour. A child's whimper, barely audible from the direction of Hollow Ridge Crossing. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so quiet it could have been missed, if he hadn't once been a father. Grabbing his flashlight, Sebastian stepped barefoot into the freezing, rain-soaked earth. His chest tightened when he saw her. A little girl trembling, clutching a torn teddy bear, her hollow eyes staring through the curtain of rain as if she no longer believed in anyone. He knelt down beside her, wrapping his own soaked jacket around her tiny shoulders, even though he himself was shivering. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Sebastian had no idea then that taking her into his truck would become the turning point, the beginning of something that would breathe life into a heart he thought had long since rotted away. A violent cough burst from his chest, a gift from a war wound that never really healed. But he stifled it, shielding her with his own body against the howling wind. And then she clutched the teddy bear tighter and whispered, "I don't want to go home. I just want to be quiet." He didn't ask why. He just opened the truck door and let her fall asleep on the makeshift bed in the back. Not because he was kind, but because he once lost a child. Anastasia Bennett, no more than 7 years old, didn't cry anymore. But the way she clung to Mr. Buttons, as if holding on to the last sliver of life she had left, tightened something in Sebastian's throat. The teddy bear's shoulder was torn, one eye dangling by a thread, its fur matted and soggy from the rain. And yet it was the one thing she never let go of, not even once, all night long. The next morning, as cold metallic sunlight filtered through the fogged-up glass, Sebastian draped an old flannel shirt around her shoulders and quietly walked 3 miles to the nearest bakery. A humble little shop where Genevieve Clark, a soft-eyed woman in a flour-dusted apron, opened her oven early every morning. He didn't explain. He just placed a few crumpled bills on the counter and pointed to a round loaf of bread. Genevieve nodded and wrapped it up. But when her gaze caught sight of Mr. Buttons peeking out from Sebastian's coat pocket, she froze, just for a second. Then without a word, she added a small paper bag. Butter cookies on the house. When Anastasia took her first bite in the back of the truck, she glanced at him for the first time. Not with fear, not with gratitude, just curiosity. And that night, as the rain softened to a quiet drizzle and Sebastian turned away to tidy up, he heard her murmur in her sleep, "Daddy Seb, don't go." He froze. No one had called him that in 8 years, and the heart he thought had turned into nothing more than a blood-pumping machine suddenly ached with every beat. She started talking more. Fragments of stories, scattered names, most of them unfamiliar to Sebastian. Until one day, that name surfaced again, Victoria. It was a quiet morning at the small cafe by the Winterbrook bus stop. A well-dressed woman stood frozen at the entrance, her eyes red-rimmed, clutching a worn photograph. When she saw Sebastian walk in, the little girl trailing behind him, holding Mr. Buttons, Victoria Langley couldn't speak, not a word. Anastasia froze too. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She simply hid behind Sebastian. And in those few suspended seconds, the past came crashing down. Victoria dropped to her knees in the middle of the cafe floor, her hands trembling as she reached out a necklace, the one her daughter used to wear. She was mine," her voice cracked. I couldn't protect her." The words echoed like a confession. By late afternoon, whispers had already swept through the town. Suspicious eyes, half-spoken rumors. Did that man kidnap the child? Why did she abandon her? Has anyone said anything yet? Then Genevieve, usually the quiet one, stepped forward. She walked into the center of the small town square, the sunlight slicing through the overhang above her. I saw the way that child trembled in fear, and the way she found peace beside Sebastian, she said, her voice steady like a vow. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by where the heart chooses to belong. Silence fell. A gust of wind swept through, lifting one of the flyers carelessly pinned to a pole. And just like that, a new chapter began, from truths long thought too painful to face. At first, she never said her name. All Sebastian knew was that she had been left behind, and that, Mom's not coming back. He didn't ask for more. But that night, he quietly drove 30 miles just to find the exact kind of gummy bears she'd mentioned once. Only once. When he handed her the bag, she looked at it, then looked at him. Her eyes lighting up in a way that said no one had ever remembered something so small before. That was the first time she reached out and touched his hand. The next day, Victoria returned. She stood outside the truck, her hands trembling as she handed over a folder. Inside, guardianship papers. I'm not trying to make amends, she said. I just want her to be where she feels safe. Sebastian didn't say a word. But that afternoon, he was out back, hammering away at the warped door of an old cabin on the edge of the valley. Genevieve arrived quietly, carrying a wooden sign she'd carved herself. It read, Anastasia's porch, home is here. The little girl saw the sign. She clutched Mr. Buttons, now lovingly stitched back together, then suddenly ran up behind Sebastian, wrapped her arms around him and whispered, Daddy? Not because they shared blood, but because he was the first one who stayed, when everyone else had already walked away. Sebastian, a man who had once lost his little girl, felt something in this child that stirred his heart awake again. That night, snow fell thick and silent outside the small wooden cabin. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly, casting a warm amber glow across the wall, where a new picture now hung, a scribbled drawing, clumsy but full of love. A man, a little girl, and a dog named Blitz standing beneath the hand-carved sign, Anastasia's porch. She gently placed Mr. Buttons, now carefully stitched and whole again, on the rocking chair where her real parents once sat beside her. Then she turned and wrapped her arms around Sebastian, whispering, I'm not scared of the dark anymore, because now I have a dad. Sebastian knelt down. He said nothing, but the tear that fell onto her hair spoke everything he couldn't. From outside, Victoria stood at the window, watching. She didn't knock. She didn't come in. She simply left behind a single card. Family is where someone's brave enough to love your child, even after losing one of their own. And the story closed in the quiet flicker of firelight as Mr. Buttons rested peacefully, stitched together with love, a witness to healing. And then a final whisper echoed through the storyteller's voice. Some tears don't need replacing. They only need someone to love them long enough to stitch them back together. The next morning, with fog still clinging to the windows and beads of water dripping from the roof of the truck, Sebastian gently placed his hand on the girl's forehead, checking her temperature the way he used to do with his own daughter. He wrapped an old wool scarf around her shoulders, then drove through the icy slopes toward Maple Crust and Cream, a small bakery on Eldermore Avenue, the only place in town that opened before dawn. The scent of fresh bread always lingered in the air there, and the owner, Genevieve Clark, was one of the rare souls who never asked why. She spotted them from across the street and opened the door without a word. All she said was, Come in. The little one needs to eat, and you need to rest. Anastasia curled up at a small wooden table near the oven, clutching Mr. Buttons, still damp and now slightly musty. Genevieve placed a slice of golden buttered toast in front of her, then gently brushed the girl's hair back. No questions about names, no curiosity about the past. Sebastian moved to decline his portion, but Genevieve set down a warm cup of ginger tea beside him and said, Eat. You can't care for someone hungry if you're starving yourself. The little girl looked at the two grown-ups, as if she didn't quite believe in kindness that asked for nothing in return. But when the toast touched her lips, her eyes welled up with tears. And for the first time, she spoke a single word. Thank you. Just that. But it was enough. Enough for Sebastian to realize he wasn't just a silent man living in a truck anymore. He had started over, with a slice of toast and a whispered thank you. Genevieve Clark, a widow who had seen too many lies disguised as kindness, kept her distance at first when Sebastian walked in that cold, rainy morning with a strange little girl by his side. He didn't say much, just quietly dried the girl's hair, placed her soaked teddy bear by the fireplace, and glanced at her from time to time, as if searching for something he had once lost. Genevieve poured more tea and sat across from them, her eyes tracing the man's every movement. Something in her, an old instinct hardened by years of disappointment, told her there was more beneath that quiet exterior, a loss too deep for words to reach. Then she saw it. Sebastian, slipping off an old ring from a chain around his neck and placing it on the table, offering it in exchange for a few extra slices of bread for the child. Her heart tightened. No one does that unless they're truly at the end of the road, or they truly care. She stepped forward, gently returned the ring, and whispered, "You don't have to pay for anything here. If that little girl is the first reason you stopped running, maybe this can be the first place you start again." Her words didn't just move Sebastian, they made Anastasia lift her gaze, for the first time that day, to meet Genevieve's eyes, and she nodded, just once. But it was enough, a silent acceptance. From that moment on, Genevieve no longer doubted. She turned to the kitchen and began slicing plum jam bread, a recipe she used to make for her own daughter long ago. And in that warm little bakery, something quiet took root. The first flicker of trust, soft, small, but real. After much thought, Genevieve Clark made a quiet decision to let them stay in the small wooden cottage beside the Winter Branch pear grove. It used to be an old flour shed for the bakery, now layered in dust and memories. She didn't say much, just left a key and a few warm blankets. Their first night there was cold and damp. Sebastian quietly lit the wood stove, then tucked Anastasia into the old bed, now layered with every jacket he had. She drifted off to sleep, still clutching Mr. Buttons. Near dawn, as the rain began to ease, a small voice pierced the stillness, and his chest tightened. "Daddy Seb, don't leave me." Sleepy, faint, but strong enough to bring down every wall he'd spent years building. Sebastian sat frozen for a long while. Then slowly he brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead and whispered, "Daddy's right here." He hadn't said those words in 10 years, hadn't dared believe he'd ever hear that name again. Not from any child, let alone one who wasn't his by blood. The next morning, when Genevieve returned, she saw him outside, hanging the bedsheets to dry. His eyes were red, but there was a quiet smile on his face, one she'd never seen before. And in that worn, dusty cottage, for the first time since losing his daughter, Sebastian began to believe there might still be room in his heart to come back to life. Little by little, Anastasia began to smile more. Not the trembling kind from that stormy night, but real, quiet smiles that warmed the air around her. Each morning she followed Sebastian to the truck, wiping the windshield with the sleeves of her oversized sweater, then tiptoeing to place Mr. Buttons on the dashboard, a loyal co-pilot who never missed a ride. One afternoon, the three of them, Sebastian, Genevieve, and Anastasia, sat outside the cabin, sharing bowls of warm soup under the pale sun. And somewhere between the silence and the soft scent of burning wood, the girl fell asleep in Sebastian's lap. Then came a whisper, software, unfiltered. "Daddy Seb." Sebastian froze. The spoon slipped from his hand, clinking against the edge of the bowl. His heart thudded, like memory itself had just woken from a long, cold sleep. No one spoke, but Genevieve's eyes softened, as if she knew. That moment wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was a milestone. That night he stepped outside, alone in the mist. In his hands, a small pendant, the one he'd carried for 10 years, the last thing left of the daughter he had lost. For the first time since the day she died, he opened it. Inside, her photo, and all the grief he had never dared to weep. He exhaled slowly, then whispered, "You're not being replaced, but I think My heart just found another rhythm worth beating for. Every morning, Sebastian stood beside Genevieve in the warm kitchen, scented with baked cinnamon, learning how to knead dough with hands that once only knew steering wheels and wrenches. Meanwhile, Anastasia scurried around the counter with an old rag, chattering endlessly about Mr. Buttons, the teddy bear who could talk, feel sad, and dream about chocolate cake. Everything felt like it was slowly healing, until one afternoon when the bakery bell rang just as Genevieve was rearranging the pastry shelf. The woman at the door stood soaked in rain, with dark circles under her eyes and a presence that seemed on the verge of collapsing. When she stepped inside and her gaze landed on the little girl laughing behind the counter with Sebastian, time seemed to stop. Anastasia! The name escaped her lips like a breath caught in sorrow. Sebastian stiffened, his hands curling into fists. Old instincts kicking in. Genevieve stepped forward, subtly placing herself between the woman and the child. But Anastasia had already gone still. She looked up at the unfamiliar woman, not with fear, but with quiet confusion. The tension in the room was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. And then Anastasia stepped back, clutched Mr. Buttons to her chest, and softly whispered, "Daddy Seb." Sebastian's heart cracked wide open. That one word spoken in the midst of cold rain and the stunned gaze of the woman who once bore her drew a line, a fragile but unmistakable boundary between past and present, between blood and love. Victoria stood quietly at the bakery counter, saying nothing throughout dinner. Not until the shop had emptied out did she finally whisper, more to herself than anyone else. 7 months ago, I left her at the hospital. I thought staying would only hurt her more, so I disappeared. I I thought walking away was the better thing to do. Her words fell into the warm kitchen air, where only the soft patter of rain on the roof remained, and the glow from the oven painted the walls in gentle gold. Genevieve tightened the dish towel in her hands, and Sebastian, the man who always found refuge in silence, said nothing. He simply glanced over at Anastasia, scribbling in crayon at the table, then turned away, gripping the wooden railing to keep his eyes from giving too much away. She calls you Daddy Seb, doesn't she?" Victoria's voice trembled. He nodded, still no words. "And she's happy, isn't she?" Genevieve stepped forward, rested a hand gently on Victoria's shoulder, for the first time, and said soft as a passing breeze, "Real love doesn't need a title. It only needs someone brave enough to stay." Victoria broke down, tears spilling freely, and Sebastian, quietly retreating into the kitchen, opened a drawer and pulled out a scrap of old fabric. He sat down and with slow, steady hands began mending a small tear on Mr. Buttons, as if giving his hands something to do when his heart felt too full to hold. That night, none of them spoke another word, but in that silence, something tender began to take root, something strange and imperfect, but real. A family. On a quiet morning at the little bakery by the Winter Branch, Pear Grove, the wind chime stirred gently, a soft, delicate sound that felt like a whisper of something coming. The door creaked open and a young woman stepped inside, her office dress unmarked by dust, her eyes scanning the room with an unease that didn't match the peaceful air. Genevieve looked up from the tray of pastries, ready to greet her, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the woman's pale face lock onto the far left corner of the room. A little girl sat there, carefree and smiling, coloring in a picture of a scruffy teddy bear. Victoria Langley. She froze in place, eyes shimmering with a storm of memory. Anastasia looked up, and in that fleeting moment, their gazes met. One held a quiet fear she didn't understand. The other, a guilt that had never truly slept. Victoria's legs faltered as if the ground beneath her shifted. She stumbled forward and lowered herself into the seat across from the girl, fingers trembling as they reached for the edge of the table. Not quite brave enough to reach for her child. Genevieve said nothing. She stood still behind the counter, watching every flicker in their expressions. Because she knew this wasn't just a reunion. This was a door cracking open, a door that held back a past wrapped in silence and sealed with pain. There were no tears, no raised voices, just the helplessness in Victoria's eyes as she turned to Genevieve and whispered, "I used to be her mother, but I don't deserve to be anymore." Behind the kitchen curtains, Sebastian stood frozen, his hand gripping the edge of a chair. He had known this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it would hurt this much. The small room in the back of the bakery was unnaturally quiet. Victoria sat there, both hands wrapped tightly around the warm cup of tea Genevieve had just made. But the steam couldn't thaw the chill in her fingers. Anastasia had been taken outside, now playing with a small dog on the porch. That left only the three of them, and a silence so heavy it felt like a rope tightening around their throats. Sebastian said nothing. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze hard, yet not unkind. And then Victoria spoke, not to justify, not to beg, but to confess. A raw, torn truth that split open a wound long scarred on the surface, but rotting underneath. "I'm her mother," she said, voice trembling. "But I left her. Not because I didn't love her, but because I was trapped in a violent marriage." She swallowed hard. "Her father, the man I once trusted, held a knife to my throat and told me to leave. I thought I'd come back, but the chance never came. They moved me, controlled me, erased me, and by the time I escaped, she was gone." She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled photograph, a worn image of a young mother and daughter by a fireplace. Mr. Buttons nestled in the little girl's hands. Tears blurred her eyes and her voice broke, almost a whisper. "There hasn't been a single day I didn't think of her, but I was too afraid to look, afraid I'd only hurt her all over again." Genevieve turned to Sebastian, her expression no longer suspicious, but torn, and for the first time, Sebastian looked away from Victoria's silhouette and bowed his head. Because some kinds of pain, only those who've lost a child can truly understand. News of Victoria Langley's true identity spread through Glenshire Hollow overnight, like a wildfire tearing through dry brush. The quiet, close-knit town suddenly split down the middle. Some called her irresponsible, a mother who abandoned her child and returned as if the damage had never happened. Others cast suspicious glances at Sebastian, a mysterious man living in a truck with no clear past, who had kept the child all this time. Inside the bakery, the way people looked at the three of them began to change. The whispers grew heavier. A once friendly elderly woman pulled her hand back from Genevieve's. A local grocer no longer offered his usual bread. Anastasia overheard it all. The quiet sting of being called the little girl caught in a tug of war. Then came worse. One afternoon, a social worker appeared, clipboard in hand, eyes emotionless. She questioned Victoria first, her voice cool, clinical. "Do you have any proof that you're the biological mother?" Victoria couldn't answer. And Sebastian, he stood behind her silent. Not out of guilt, but because the question had cut clean into a wound he thought had already scarred. That night, in the little cabin by the pear grove, no one spoke. Genevieve brewed tea, but her hands trembled. Sebastian sat with his arm over his forehead, unable to sleep. And Anastasia, curled up with Mr. Buttons, whispered into the dark, "I don't want to leave." And in that moment, beneath every doubt, every fracture, every bruise, there was only love, raw, wordless, unshaken. But the question lingered in the silence. Would love alone be enough to keep them together? As rumors spread and wary eyes turned toward the small wooden cabin by the pear grove, Genevieve Clark did something no one expected. She stood before the entire community at an emergency town meeting inside Willowshade Hall and spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but every word threaded through the tension in the room, like stitches holding back a wound on the verge of splitting open into judgment. "I was the first one to see the way he held Anastasia. Not with pity, but with the heart of a father who had already lost everything," she said. "I was there that morning when he skipped his own meal just so she could have a slice of warm bread." She paused, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a child's crumpled drawing. Sebastian, seated at a table, sewing Mr. Buttons back together with bright green thread. "She drew this on a rainy night. She told me, 'Daddy Seb is fixing my bear, just like he's fixing my heart.'" The hall fell silent. One man looked down. An older woman dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Genevieve turned to Victoria, who stood at the back of the room, her hands trembling. He never made promises, Genevieve continued, but everything he's done says one thing. She will not be abandoned again. And if that isn't the heart of a father, then tell me, what is? Victoria broke into quiet sobs, and for the first time, Sebastian stepped forward. He didn't look away. He didn't lower his gaze. He simply met the eyes of the town and said, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance. To keep a promise, a father should never break. And slowly, one by one, the town nodded. Not because they believed in the past, but because they saw the love that lived in the present. That afternoon, a soft wind whispered through the winter branch pear grove, and the golden light of dusk filtered through the trees, as if the world itself had paused to witness a moment words could never fully hold. Victoria Langley stood quietly in front of the small wooden house, where her daughter sat on the porch, scribbling a drawing of 3 people on the worn wooden boards. Her eyes were red, her hands clutched a file of documents, trembling just enough to betray the storm inside her. It took her a long while to speak. When she finally turned to Sebastian, once a shadow in this town, now crouched down, wiping dirt off the girl's shoes with an old cloth, her voice broke. You didn't have to do any of it, she said, barely above a whisper. But you did, not out of duty, but because you cared. Sebastian said nothing, but as he rose, a worn-out light in his eyes suddenly seemed to flicker with something new. Victoria opened the folder in her hands and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Signed. Her voice quivered as she continued. She calls you Dad. I couldn't earn that. I wasn't brave enough. I didn't feel worthy. But you did what every mother hopes someone would do. You protected her when she was at her weakest. She placed the paper into his hands, then leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead, still asleep in Sebastian's arms. I'm not losing her. I'm letting her be loved, the way she deserves. Sebastian's chest tightened. Tears came, not from triumph, but from receiving a gift he never thought he was allowed to hope for. The gift of a mother who had once shattered, now choosing to give again. This time, with grown-up love. From a distance, Genevieve watched with a quiet smile. Above the door of the cabin, a new sign had just been hung. Anastasia's porch. Home is here. And for the first time, the 3 of them stepped into the house together, as if they had belonged there all along. Late afternoon, beneath the soft shadows of the pear trees, with golden dusk outlining every emotion like a stroke of light, Anastasia burst from the wooden cabin, teddy bear in hand, eyes glistening with sunlight and tears. She ran straight into Sebastian's arms, throwing herself around him as if letting go might make the whole world feel empty again. Sebastian dropped to his knees, arms wide open, and when her tiny frame pressed against his chest, he couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears streamed down his cheeks, falling onto her shoulder, onto the earth that had once been too dry for anything soft to grow. I'm here, he whispered, voice cracking. I'm not going anywhere. From the porch steps, Genevieve stood silently, hands clenched to her chest, struggling not to cry. For months she had watched this man, a broken soul, rise not for himself but for a child who shared no blood with him. And now together, they were building something that looked a lot like a family, not made from documents, but from choices. Victoria, standing farther off, turned quietly to leave. But before stepping down the red clay slope, she paused, looked back at the little house, then glanced at Genevieve. They have each other now, she said, voice light as wind. And she finally has a place to call home. The new sign above the porch swayed gently in the breeze. Anastasia's porch. Home is here. A sparrow landed on the roof's edge. And in the hearts of everyone who had watched it all unfold, something had been stitched back together. Quietly, slowly, but forever. In the early days of winter, as frost still blanketed the rooftops and the soft crackle of firewood became the heartbeat of the little wooden home, they began to rebuild. One brick, one weathered plank at a time. Sebastian worked steadily, releveling the warped steps. Genevieve brought home pots of lavender for the windowsills, and Anastasia, still clutching Mr. Buttons, ran from corner to corner, laughter echoing through the clang of hammers and the thud of timber, like the rhythm of a new heartbeat for a house slowly becoming a home. The building that was once a cold flower shed by the pear grove now glowed each morning as sunlight streamed through hand-stitched curtains, casting the shadows of three figures onto the wooden walls. At night, they gathered around the old kitchen table, sharing bowls of warm soup Genevieve prepared, while the little girl told stories of how Daddy Seb had fixed a wobbly chair just so Mr. Buttons could eat dinner properly. And then one crisp morning, Sebastian nailed a small wooden sign to the doorway. Anastasia's porch. Home is here. No one said a word. Genevieve simply squeezed his hand, gently. Anastasia looked up at the sign, her eyes shimmering. Then she turned and whispered, "We have a home now, Mr. Buttons." And in that moment, without paperwork, without shared blood, the little wooden house became a symbol of something deeper, a choice. That love, when real enough, can rebuild what was once broken. Not perfectly, but wholly enough to stitch back every tear with something that lasts. That late afternoon, the fireplace in the newly rebuilt cabin glowed once again. Anastasia curled up in the armchair, Mr. Buttons cradled in her arms. The same bear once torn at the ear, now stitched back together with bright red thread that stood out boldly against his worn, cream-colored fur. Genevieve sat beside her, traces of thread still clinging to her fingertips. She had mended it quietly the night before, while Sebastian had fallen asleep on the floor, exhausted from a long night of installing the new windows. "She said she doesn't want a new bear," Genevieve whispered, her gaze fixed on Mr. Buttons. "She just wants something that's been broken and still kept." Sebastian didn't answer. He simply stepped closer, rested a hand on her shoulder, his eyes landing on the corner of the fireplace, where the firelight danced across the bear's stitches, making the red thread glimmer like a scar filled with gratitude. And in that quiet moment, all the things they couldn't say, the pain they carried, the mistakes that couldn't be undone, and the love that didn't need blood to be real, found their place. Outside, the wooden sign swayed gently in the breeze. Anastasia's porch, home is here. And the story closed on a single, haunting image. Mr. Buttons, fully mended, resting on a wooden shelf beside the fire. A quiet emblem of every wound that had finally been healed. As the last light of day streamed through the foggy window of maple crust and cream, something remarkable happened. No fanfare, no fireworks, just three people sitting at the same table, a man who once lived in silence, a woman who once ran from her past, and a little girl who once cried beneath a bridge. They shared warm bread. They laughed over a ridiculous story about Mr. Buttons breaking his arm while saving his owner from an imaginary fire-breathing dragon. There were no blood ties, no legal papers, but in Anastasia's eyes, in Genevieve's laughter, and in Sebastian's rough, calloused hand, wrapped gently around the girls, there was something that said everything that mattered. They were a family. People still stopped by the little bakery on Eldermore Avenue every day, not just for the buttery scent in the air or the slightly crooked sign that reads Anastasia's porch. They come because something rare and precious lives there. The quiet belief that broken things can heal, if we're brave enough to love again. And if you've ever felt lost, if you've ever known heartbreak, if you've ever wondered whether love can truly return, then maybe this story was a gentle message meant for you. What do you believe makes a family? Tell us in the comments. If this story touched your heart, hit subscribe and help us keep these almost lost things alive. Because who knows, maybe the next miracle will be your story. There are some encounters in life that don't begin with names, but with a glance. Silent, wary, and slowly softened into trust. The story of Sebastian, Genevieve, and little Anastasia is no fairy tale. It began beneath a damp bridge, inside a cold, rusting truck, with a man who had lost everything, even his reason to keep going. But the faint cry of a child, a tattered teddy bear, and one hesitant hug began stitching together the hollow parts of a heart that had long gone quiet. None of the three were perfect. Genevieve carried wounds of her own, yet chose to open a bakery, and with it, her heart. Victoria once ran from fear but came back out of courage, And Sebastian, a man with nothing left, chose to give everything he had left to a child who shared no blood, with nothing more than one pure thing: genuine love. The lesson? Family isn't born from blood, but from choice. Love doesn't need vows, just one person willing to stay when everyone else walks away. And sometimes the deepest tears, in the soul and memory, are exactly where the light finds its way in. Life doesn't always need the right answer. Sometimes it just needs arms wide enough to remind someone they are still loved.